Imagine it's 2023 and the gavel is in the hands of Kevin McCarthy. I'm sorry, but it could happen. I'm Lizzie Hersey. I'm a volunteer with Airlift. After retiring from my nursing career at UCSF, Allison Whitaker said, come check this out. Airlift spoke to me and I immediately knew it was the best bang for my political buck. Why? Because Airlift does the work for you, for us. In a nutshell, Airlift funds grassroots groups in battleground states. The grassroots groups are primarily made up of and targeting young people and people of color. Neighbor to neighbor, they are engaging these young people, turning non-voters into voters based on the issues that matter most to them. So this evening, I'm going to give you an overview of what's coming up. Predominantly, we will be in conversation with Danny and Jonathan Paik. We won't be in the conversation, but we'll be observing it. You can put your questions in the chat as we go along, and our friend Christopher will bring those up later. Jonathan Paik is the executive director of OCCET. Don't forget to mute. Jonathan is the executive director of OCCET, which is our group in Orange County that we fund, and we have some work to do in Orange County, and you're going to find out why. After we have the conversation, there'll be a question and answer period. And again, put your questions in the chat. Following the question and answers, I will return. At which time, we'll talk about how you can get involved with Airlift now. If anybody wants to stay afterwards this evening because they didn't get their questions answered, Danny and I believe Jonathan also will be hanging around for 10 to 15 minutes. So for now, take it away, Danny.
Thank you, Lizzie. This evening, we're going to take a trip down to Orange County. What I love about these sessions is that we get to meet people who are changing this country. One of these people is Jonathan Paik. He will be our tour guide this evening. He was born in Orange County, so he knows it really well. First, I want to just give you a taste of what Jonathan and I will be covering tonight. Since Airlift is all about bottom up, we're going to talk about some exciting wins on Orange County city councils and school boards. In my research for tonight, I found out that there are 34 cities in Orange County. That is insane. And then on everybody's mind, how to take back 2 Orange County congressional seats that we flipped in 2018 and lost in 2020. And then we're going to talk about some really big stuff. We'll share with you some exciting work that OCCET is doing and Airlift is helping with to reshape California politics. Okay, Jonathan, glad you're here. Let's dive in. I have a million questions. Do you have a million answers?
I hope so. I hope I have a million answers, but I'm going to try my best and excited to speak with everyone here and talk about my hometown. And yeah, excited to make some change happen.
Cool. So let's start with a few basic ones. You grew up in Orange County. How was that Orange County different from the one you live in now?
Yeah, that's a great question. My family had moved upon my birth in 1988 to Fullerton as one of the first Korean American families actually moving out to North Orange County, coming from LA County, where my mother grew up and went to high school. And so I think growing up, Ronald Reagan was considered God. I think for a lot of our public schools, it was not uncommon for our schools, public or private, for teachers to be able to really kind of think through what it really meant for folks to be able to celebrate Reaganomics, celebrate fiscal conservatism, and really kind of celebrate this idea that immigrants and communities and mixed status families like mine were not welcome in our county. I think in Orange County, it was a unique place. It's a unique place where there's a lot of individualism, a lot of anti-labor sentiments, and I think growing up around that, I've grown up in a family. My mother's a public school teacher in LA Unified School District, out in the corridor, the 605 corridor, and that's the reason why I actually learned how to be able to organize. Is watching my mother strike in the year I was born in 1988. And really 30 years later, being able to strike with her again in 2018 during the UTLA teacher strike. So, really for me, I'm fortunate for the way I grew up to be able to be blessed with a family who really believes in community values and community interest and being able to take care of each other. And I think that basic principle alone, and I believe that in Orange County, even though there are powerful forces, conservative forces, being able to put us down, I really believe that the majority in Orange County that we imagine can really imagine the future for our county very differently. And we've already started doing that, and excited to be able to share more later.
So Orange County Civic Engagement Table, what is that?
That's a great question. So the Orange County Civic Engagement Table is an alliance of API, Latinx, Labor and Environmental Justice Alliance, that was really kind of built really at the earlier part of the decade, because we recognized quickly that even though the demographics were shifting very quickly in Orange County to a majority people of color county, we had also recognized that without our collective working together, we would not be able to actually see the type of transformation and change in the region in order to be able to make it. And so
could everybody please mute so we can hear Jonathan? Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
No worries. So that's what we are. We're a partnership of 7 organizations. We're soon about to very likely expand to additional partners across the county. We largely work and do voter engagement work, particularly with communities that have never reached in our elections, folks who are non-English speaking, folks who are young people of color, folks who are students growing up here, folks who are impacted or undocumented, folks who are low-income workers who are facing the pandemic and really making our county operate and run every day. So that's really who we are as a table, and we're an alliance that really are committed to work together to be able to change our county.
So what issues do these people care about most, Jonathan?
That's a great question. I think for us, there's a number of myriad of issues that folks are working on every day. From, we have arguably one of the largest direct service providers for public health and access. So they've been working on being able to ensure that vaccinations reach our most impacted populations during the pandemic. We have organizations that have been leading the fight on anti-deportation fight, as we were fighting provisions like 287G in the county, which we were the last county in California to be able to actually uphold an agreement. For folks who are less aware about what 287G is, it's an agreement between the sheriff and ICE departments to be able to actually have a partnership to be able to increase deportations or to be able to actually incarcerate a lot of our undocumented families. And so I think for us, there's our other community partners have continued to work to be able to fight for hazard pay right now, especially in times as grocery workers continue to be able to work in an extended period during the pandemic. And in addition, being able to hold our electeds accountable to be able to make sure that all happens in the midst of an electorate transformation in the region. I think we're demanding a new type of governance and a relationship between the state and its people. So that's what our issues that we really care about, and excited to share more.
So collectively, how many people would you say that OCCET has on staff? And I guess you would have to include all of the groups that are a part of OCCET, right?
Yeah, so I would say for the scope of, so the staff at OCCET, which is like really the hub, is really 4 core staff. For our network partners, I would say if we're to give a rough estimate across 7 partners, we're talking anywhere between 20 to 32 staff. So we run lean and mean, and we're gonna, I think for us, we have a lot of capacity to grow, but that's really kind of the extent and size. I would say though, during election seasons and when we were running campaigns, our team size gets anywhere between 80 to 120 people. So, big operations running out and a lot of leadership demonstrated by our staff.
I think we're ready to go on the tour. Jonathan has some slides for us. Where do you want to take us, Jonathan?
Sure. So I'm going to try my best to make this as interesting as possible for our political terrain. Do folks see a big sign that says OCCET Action, Orange County Political Terrain? All right, great. I'm also new to Zoom too, so please let me know if folks see something differently. So I'm going to start sharing kind of just like in regards to like an election that everyone can feel some accessibility to, the presidential vote. So if folks remember, we're really looking at information from 1992 to 2020. This is really a line graph to be able to demonstrate the partisan differences and changes that have really happened over the course. And one of the most interesting figures I saw, I didn't know that 1992 Ross Perot, Orange County had a 24% vote for Ross Perot in 92. But what the important trend to be able to illustrate here was that you're starting to be able to see a partisan trend really kind of grow across the region, that there's been an increased Democratic strongholds being able to be built in Orange County, where in 2016, Hillary Clinton was the first presidential candidate since World War II to be able to actually be a Democratic candidate to actually win the election in Orange County. And 2020, that trend's continued to follow with Biden. And you continue to also see a downturn of Republican Party turnout. So as high as in 2004, you saw a 60% Republican turnout favoring a Republican candidate. And we had understood that in order for us to be able to make that shift, particularly in the last decade, you'll see that really our work really started in 2011 and 2012. So we really kind of considered that as like really the marker from really thinking about the demographic shift. And then from there, how are we going to actually empower our communities to be able to continue to see this type of growth? So, this is really kind of like a first foray in landscape across the county. And you'll also see here that there's been a population shift across the county that really was signified in 2010. And you'll start really seeing here the total population over time that's really happening is that you'll see a trend across since 2010 that a white population has continued to decrease while Latinx continues to stay somewhat steady. You see a significant growth in Asian American populations with a steady growth of African American, Native American, and Pacific Islander populations across the county. But I think in particular in Asian American communities, just to be able to uplift, we're particularly seeing significant growth in Chinese communities as well as in Vietnamese communities. And I think we can share more later about what that means for us to be able to engage with folks on the ground, what kind of political dynamics that we're facing in the opposition in this space, and what Republicans are doing actively to be able to organize within and infiltrate within our communities that I think is a concern as a playbook for the rest of the country. So for us, when we actually look at this, we're actually as Danny shared, there are 34 cities across the county. So we actually started measuring how many cities in Orange County actually have a majority people of color population. So we've actually identified over 18 cities that are actually have a majority people of color county. And it's by no accident that we're actually seeing here in this chart that there's been a significant growth since 10 years ago to be able to actually see where there's an opportunity for communities across cultures to be able to work and organize together to build power. And so you'll see in terms of the lowest population, Costa Mesa, folks may be familiar with the city in Southwest Orange County, with the most dense population of people of color being in Santa Ana, with a 91% people of color population, which it's our largest city in Orange County. There's about 350,000 people. So that's in relation, that's a slightly smaller than Seattle. So like, I think for us, like just to be able to kind of give a sense or understanding, like that's kind of where we're really looking at it at this point. So just to be able to share here, that's kind of like what we're looking at in regards to our county. And just to be able to share it in terms of size and scope of our county is roughly around 3.1 million people. So our county alone is roughly larger than about 19 states in the country. So I think for us, just to be able to share, when we actually think about Orange County strategy, it's really the equivalent of what we would see in a statewide strategy in other states across the country. So I want to be able to share a map that really kind of shows how people are voting across the county. So this is really like a presidential map in 2016. And you'll start seeing here, particularly in North Orange County, where, this is where the Congressional District 39th is. You'll start also seeing Central Orange County, which has been like the long-time hub of people of color who have been working together to organize progressive policy. So in the city of Santa Ana, where you see this heavy blue, they have actually passed the strongest sanctuary city policy arguably in the country. So I think for us, just to be able to share, there's been concentration of really good work at the local level. And you'll also see this interesting growth of blue or gray in the Congressional District 45th, which would largely be determined here in Irvine. And then from here, you'll see this is kind of like the makeup of the 48th, really in the Huntington Beach, Costa Mesa, and windows of Santa Ana, Garden Grove. So I think for us, really kind of looking at the political makeup in 2016, this is kind of like where we really saw the map with the election for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So I think here is kind of where we've seen the shifts that I think are both illuminating and concerning. So you'll see that the margin actually grew for Biden support compared to Hillary Clinton by 3% across the county. But you'll also see a lot less shades of dark blue, meaning that you're actually seeing a lot less density. And what we're seeing particularly is that particularly in API dense communities, particularly Southeast Asian communities and East Asian communities, that the case is actually becoming that there's been more organizing from the right to be able to organize communities like mine to be able to actually advance a conservative agenda. So you'll see also that, there's been slots of blue that we're starting to see down here in Southern Orange County, Laguna Beach areas, as well as Aliso Viejo, but you'll start seeing, and then you'll see growth here in Irvine as well. But I think particularly in North County, as well as like a little bit in Central and West County, you're starting to see appeal. And I think for us, like as Danny and I speak more about what this means, and as people of color continue to be able to advance a conservative agenda, what does that actually mean in terms of our organizing strategy that we have to actually circumvent? And so for us, when we actually look at a presidential candidate support, you'll see that these are by like a city by city breakdown. So for us, when we actually we actually continue to look at city by city, because we really believe that grassroots power starts at the city level, and then we'll build cities in an aggregate that actually builds up a majority. So you'll see here that there are roughly anywhere between 12 to 13 cities that really kind of are above the average of how voters voted for Joe Biden for president. While we have like the remaining half largely in South County that are voting under 50% in support of Biden. And we're not really sure how much of this has to do with the turnout of Trump or like, where the margins are closing, but happy to be able to share more about what this actually means in practice for us. So for us, we're actually looking at like the majority people of color cities. So if folks remember the maps from blue and red, the denser the color, the more people of color aggregates there are. So you'll see that here, this is not the Orange County that we grew up in, right? This is an Orange County that is vastly changing very rapidly. And you'll start seeing here that it's really a local strategy down to the nit and grit that is really going to help determine what fate of of our collaborative of API, Latinx, labor, and environmental justice organizers are going to be able to do, knowing that our communities are living all across the county now. So this is a picture that's vastly different from even 10 years ago. And we're going to continue to be able to actually leverage and see what this actually means. And for us, for example, on that fight is that, part of our fights right now is that we're actually trying to be able to advance a 10-year strategy that's going to build towards a county board fight. And as you can imagine, a county board of 5 districts with a population of 3.1 million people, most of our county board seats are actually larger than, or as large as congressional districts. So if you're actually really thinking about the scope and size of that work, we're talking about massive power and work that's actually happening within the county board. And we really find that both through redistricting as well as through our continued organizing and grassroots power building work that we're doing, that we're going to actually see an opportunity for us to be able to see a route to build power through the county board. And we understand that the county board, given the size and scope and scale of the districts, are often not the first districts or first elections that they're running for. So we need to actually prepare them through city council fights, through school board fights, our parents, our teachers, to be able to actually be prepared to govern. And so for us, this is where we're really kind of building towards, is that we're winning many elections at the city level that Danny and I should be sharing later, that really builds a trajectory for what it means to be able to build county-wide power. And to be able to share who makes up our county board, we have one Democrat who is a pretty moderate Democrat, was a former Republican and changed parties later. And 4 Republicans. And actually, what's unique about our county, we have one special election that's going on right now for the district, for District 2 that now Congressmember Michelle Steele used to occupy. But I think at this point in time, this is kind of where we see a makeup of 3 Republican county board members, all people of color, and all actually East Asian and Southeast Asian. So to be able to share, it's this is not a strategy that's going away. People who look like me and who look like my family members, and this is not going to be an exception for Latinx conservative candidates that are going to be running too soon in Orange County that we continue to see. So yeah, that is my short presentation. I will stop sharing here. And yeah, happy to be able to continue the dialogue.
Yeah, so Jonathan, I want to jump into the endorsement process because number one, because Airlift helped to fund that process, but also because I think about endorsements as just putting a stamp on a candidate, and it really was more of a vetting process. Could you talk about how that worked?
Yes, so up until last year, we had not really had a joint endorsement process across our 7 leaders who represent our C4 board, to be able to really kind of identify the cross issues between labor, immigration, criminal justice, labor fights. And so what we really wanted to be able to do is actually provide a very extensive process to say for short, for our candidates to really listen to what our community issues are, how we actually evaluate a candidate, and as well as being able to ensure that we actually start building a relationship with said elected after we help them get elected. So for us, we had, part of the resources that Airlift was able to provide OCCET Action for us was that we were able to actually spend staff time on building a 6-page questionnaire that would actually evaluate how they feel about policing in our communities, especially after the recent uprisings, from how folks feel about creating city plans to be able to create an environmentally just city, to actually seeing their stance on the relationship between city police and ICE. And so for us, we had an opportunity to be able to have honest dialogue from Democratic candidates from all levels. So we had interviewed school board members, city council members, state legislative members, as well as congressional candidates as well. And I think for us, what we had recognized was that this was going to be the first foray for being able to see how well they'd be able to respond to community. So we had completed a questionnaire, had all of our board members actually participate and lead in the interview process, as well as make our first joint slate endorsement that actually complemented and actually determined how we'd actually spend the rest of our field resources in reaching our community. I think part of how folks have seen our field is that they see that because we have an ability to talk to non-English speakers, they assume that because it's a Democrat running against a Republican, that that candidate's in the best of our interests. And the reality for us is that there's a lot of Democrats who does not necessarily align with our values either. And so for us, we had to actually recognize that in order to be able to adequately share with a lot of our community members that this candidate will fight for us, right? Like that was like really the premise. Who are the candidates that are willing to fight for us? That really gave this motivation for us to be able to run a joint field program together after our endorsement process. But that type of deliberation and space has never really been here in the county, especially at the community level. And the fact that we were able to partner with labor to do that actually created an increased alignment for us to be able to center the candidates that would really address the issues that we care about.
So one quick question, and then I want to jump into some bigger stuff that's kind of closer to statewide issues. So just tell people like what the election results were in terms of the city council races.
Sure. So for the first time in my recent history or lifetime, I think I think for us, largely speaking, the only city council that actually had a Democratic majority was Santa Ana. Santa Ana, as the largest city, actually moved to a first-time progressive majority, not just a Democratic majority city council. And there were actually three other cities that actually moved to a Democratic majority. Those cities are the city of Fullerton, Buena Park, and Irvine. And so when we actually think about it, we're thinking about like very different cities that are building a progressive electorate and majority. And for us, I think, we're really looking at what does it mean for us to be able to have a plethora and wealth of candidates that are actually running and winning at the city council level that we can prepare for higher offices. And I think for us, of these 16 candidates that we were able to endorse, 11 were successful in being able to win. And so I think for us, and that really led to now we can actually have a Buena Park City Council that's willing to be able to advocate for police oversight commissions with actual legal and litigation power. We're able to actually fight in Santa Ana for actually, they're going to be able to continue to expand opportunities for undocumented folks to be able to serve on commissions because we believe that residents, regardless of their status, have the opportunity to be able to provide insight for their cities. These are the types of stories that we're trying to be able to inspire. And this will be the first time where in city councils, we're going to be able to advance citizens redistricting commissions at the city level, which just to be clear, I was a plaintiff in the California Voting Rights Act work in the city of Fullerton to fight for district elections. And none of those city council members even wanted district-based elections. And we're a city of 180,000 people. So just to be able to actually share, this is the type of change that we're anticipating to see at the city level. And we only anticipate that growing as we continue to grow more power. Okay.
I promised myself that we'd leave some time for a bigger picture conversation. And I want to talk about California, the fifth largest country in the world that we all live in. I want to talk about structural work, the stuff that makes big leaps possible. And I want to talk about the California donor table. Jonathan, Airlift and OCCET are both very connected to this mysterious entity. Tell people or answer the question, what is the California donor table?
Sure. So it's interesting since Ludwig's on this call too. So I think happy to be able to defer that too. But the California donor table has been a coordinated effort to be able to ensure that that there could be dollars from individual donors across the state to be able to actually support work like ours, to be able to transform city councils, school boards, and to be able to work specifically on C4 side, whether it's around endorsement work that we continue to do, whether it's the continued field work as we engage in campaigns, as well as like the training of candidates across our region. And I think the donor table has been a great coordinator and like a great facilitator between resources and the work that we do. Number two, it's a great place for us to be able to co-conspire. So I probably email Dr. Ludovic and Tim Molina probably once a week. And number three is the fact that it's really a resource that actually coordinates and connects with other regional tables. So, there are tables like ours in San Diego, in the Inland Empire, in the Bay Area. And I think for us, through our work or connection through CDT, where we've been able to actually build a stronger relationship to advance more collective work across regions that are like ours.
Okay, so you talked about one of the brilliant projects that they worked on, and this goes back more than 10 years, because that's when the California Voting Rights Act was passed. And that's really what makes a lot of these local victories possible, because if ethnic groups are concentrated in particular areas, it makes it much more likely that they'll be able to elect people who look like them to city councils and school boards, right?
That's right. So, we had started with the fight in 2014 with Measures L&M, and it was to be able to implement district elections in the city of Anaheim. City of Anaheim is the second largest city in the county. And we had recognized that if we were able to, given the corporate interest of Disney in Anaheim, and to be able to actually take that kind of power shift on, if we were successful in Anaheim, there'd be a cascading effect across the county. We went from the first city in Anaheim, won the ballot measure, and 6 years later, we actually have 26 different jurisdictions now that actually have district-based elections that have now created the conditions and opportunity for us to be able to win these city council seats. So for us, it's we start with an idea and a fight. We make like a landmark fight in one city, and then we basically fight like hell for the rest of it. And so for us, that was the cascading effect that now has a plethora of opportunities at this point to be able to continue to advance work at the local level.
Okay, so I think we have enough time to talk about one more project that's on the books now. You want to make it easier for brown and black people to get elected to be county supervisors and district attorneys. So why does the way we run these elections need to be changed?
Sure. So I'll share a personal anecdote. In 2018, we had run a county sheriff independent expenditure, and we had started looking, when was the last time in Orange County that a sheriff actually qualified to make it to a general election where the majority of the electorate can actually win? And we had recognized that it was 40 years since we actually had a mandatory county runoff under current law that actually qualified for a November election. For folks who know around the call, that primary election turnout and November turnout is vastly different. The electorate is much more diverse in November. The electorate in the primary is much wealthier and wider. And we continue to be able to see across the county that we need to be able to actually shift how county elections are actually determined to actually go to a runoff. And so we're working very closely with actually three partners across the state that Airlift may be familiar with. One is Alliance San Diego, who is our court partner in San Diego, and also passed a local resolution like that, and is really the proof of concept that this works. The IU United, which is our Inland Empire counterpart, as well as Communities for a New California, CNC. And so for us, we had continued to be able to actually start building this campaign called SB 286. It's a bill that is being introduced by Senator David Min. That's actually up for hearing next Monday. But for us, we're actually trying to see if we can actually make mandatory county runoff elections as long as there's a second plurality of voters, a second candidate that was able to secure a plurality of voters to be able to go to November. And I think for us, largely speaking, it's really to be able to maximize our opportunities to be able to actually progress people, elect people who are very much like us, or folks who really believe in our values, and really be able to actually build up the case and opportunity for us to be able to continue to win. And I think for us, from a criminal justice lens, really thinking through at this point, what does it mean for us to maximize the opportunities for us to be able to truly elect and have the general electorate elect sheriffs and district attorneys across the state. We know that Orange County is not the only story in across the state that faces this type of systemic barrier. And we want to make sure that folks in the general election have a right to be able to actually elect these such critical seats across the county.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. We're going to move on to Q&A. And just a hint, there's one big topic we didn't have time to get to. So if somebody wants to ask why California has the biggest number of unregistered but eligible people to vote in the entire country, that would be a good question. Chris, go ahead. Sorry to load the dice. I had to.
There's nothing in the chat. So you've covered it all. But why don't you answer that question? Why are there so Texas has 4.5 million eligible voters, but they're non-voters. And it's almost from a perspective of California, we almost expect that. Of course, it's Texas, but they're only number 2. Number 1 is California. From your perspective, Jonathan, why might that be? What's the reason for that?
You know, that's a great question. I think, well, we had I think there's a couple answers that I would say really define that. One is that I think the history of disenfranchisement, and we've seen that the systemic barriers that we've removed, whether it's through district-based elections or otherwise, have actually increased turnout dramatically at the local level. And I think a lot of these elections at the federal level, I think congressional races aside, whether it's like U.S. Senate or presidential, that the mainstream media actually focuses on, has largely felt irrelevant for a lot of our families who feel like, okay, it's California, really thinking about this election piece. And then also I think for us, like if I were to imagine like folks like my grandmother who's been living here for 40 years, like for 45 years now, I really think through like, when in her life has she ever had the opportunity for someone to knock on her door and actually say that her vote is important? And I think that infrastructure for communities like ours are pretty new. I would say like growing up here in Orange County, I never, I didn't actually knock the door until I did it myself in my hometown. So I think for us, like that infrastructure for however we call it, the new American majority, or like for community, like immigrant populations, communities of color across the state, I don't think that strategy in the field has really been as robust as we see now, and we're going to continue to see that grow. And then I think number 2 is the fact that I think we're a state that's complicated and dense, and it's hard to compare apples to apples, and Texas is a big state too, but I would say it's, we really consider this an 8 or 9 state strategy. Orange County has like a pretty phenomenal voter turnout, but I think for us, like we recognize that there's a ton of unregistered voters in our county. So like the number is skewed. We understand that in the Central Valley, it's a large valley to be able to cover a lot of folks. And we're still continuing to build the community organizing and voter engagement infrastructure to be able to build that scale. So I think for me, what has been the most critical and most interesting has been, one, being able to actually build, being able to continue to invest in the infrastructure of community organizations and alliances like ours to be able to continue to see that growth. And 2, to be able to continue to remove systemic barriers, whether that's enfranchisement of voting, being able to change election law, whether that means to automatically register voters to vote, which is our second statewide campaign. I think for us, like that's really where we really believe that California can take the lead, like go from a position of like low voter turnout or low registration to a place where we can actually where we can set the example for the rest of the country. I really believe that. So
great.
That's my short answer.
Another question is really around your perspective concerning taking back those 2 congressional seats in Orange County.
That's a great question.
What approach? What's the opportunity? How can we help?
That's a great question. I think for the congressional races, as folks probably followed, the 39th congressional district was incredibly close. We're talking like a margin of under 6,000 voters. And Harley Ruta's race, we're talking within 1%. So I think for us, I'll share a little bit about what the opposition is doing, and then I think for me, what we're doing right now. So when the congressional races went live, and I think a significant difference is a couple things. One is that there had been women, like 2 women of color, Young Kim, the Republican candidate for the 39th, and Michelle Park Steele in the 48th district, who were very different candidates from, Young Kim had run before and was arguably the most competitive in the district that is most likely to be Democratic based on party numbers, as well as in the 48th district, Michelle was very different from Dana Rohrabacher, who was the predecessor. I think part of it is the fact that we need to continue to invest in the field. I think both, Harley Ruda had a clear understanding of how he got to his seat, and I think for Gil Cisneros, I think there was a different question about like whether he wanted to be able to continue to receive community support to be able to advance his district. So for us, I think like that's part of it, and also like I think there continues to be a deeper infiltration for within API communities where, and particularly communities of color, where we're going to continue to see Republicans who look like us actually continue to run and be more prepared to run, and frankly, be more well-financed to run. Michelle Steele was, I believe, from what I learned late in the election last year, we had seen late last year that like she was by far the most invested House Republican race in the country. And so for us, there's a competition across donors to be able to actually see if there's an investment. But I think most importantly, like we need to be able to actually start vetting the most inspiring candidate now. And I think we've started to do that. And I think being able to really invest in the year-round work, folks don't remember in 2018 that we started the field at the beginning of 2017 to be able to actually get these folks elected. It was really an 18-month field campaign. Like we were on doors every day. And I think for us, the reality is that there just wasn't that type of investment in our region. I think folks were hoping most of the projections I saw at the federal level were folks saying that it could be a landslide Democratic win in Orange County. And the reality is everyone in the local region knew that it wasn't going to be, that it was going to be close at best. And the reality for us is that we saw the worst case scenario. And I think for us, in contrast to Katie Porter, like Katie Porter has been demonstrating some large national leadership at the federal level, and folks knew that. So it cut through like her response to the failure of the federal government for COVID response. And I'm not sharing this as a champion for Katie Porter because I've had my challenges with their offices too, but like the reality is that they had demonstrated leadership, like quality and strong leadership on behalf of our region that I think was very relevant for her district. And for us, like I think we hadn't seen that time the same parallels of leadership with both Ruda and Gil Cisneros. So for us, like in terms of what we can do, I think we invest early. We invest in the field strategy right now. We invest in, as soon as it's safe to go back on doors, go back now this summer, and really start talking to our community members what it really means for Congress members to represent our regions. And I think that's really kind of the call to action for us to be able to take the 2 seats back. The field won it for us before, and we're going to win it again. So that's my.
So Jonathan, drill down on that even more so. So there are a couple of questions here, which is really give us some guidance around specifics.
Chris, heads up, 2 minutes.
Okay.
I got this.
Give some guidance relative to some specific actions that we can take and where are the opportunities relative to resources. You mentioned a couple, but just drill down for a moment.
Sure. I think like the clear ask for me is like, please move resources both for infrastructures like ours to be able to continue to like do the organizing work, to get back out on the doors, to get the equipment and infrastructure ready for us to be able to do so. Please get to know the candidates themselves. Like get to know Jay Chen, who's running again in the 39th district, and Harley Ruda again, if folks haven't, and be able to really get to know those folks. And then I think for us, I would say like for us in terms of resources, like focus on that. And then like really kind of think through at this point, what are the overlaying geographies that's going to support? Is it tied to our local strategy that we're doing right now? And is there a pathway for us to be able to sustain long-term power in those districts instead of having one-off, one-on swing districts? So for me, like really, and then, you know, as we continue to organize more spaces like this, I'd love to invite other local organizers who can share their take as well.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Yes.
Um,
Back to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jonathan. I know that you're a busy guy, Jonathan. I appreciate your very precise reports and how deliberately you've kept us in the loop. And we'll find a way to get answers to the kind of remaining questions. Actually, there's going to be a little time afterwards, so we may have time to get those answered. And thank you for joining us and for so passionately, I know you can't help it, telling your story. So I want to close with a message about California. I think now everybody understands a little bit better why we're focusing on our backyard. Californians are very altruistic, and we do a good job worrying about the rest of the country, particularly battleground states. Airlift's message now, it's time to return to base. We're starting a new fund called Airlift California, which you'll be hearing more about soon. And you've also heard us talk about the California donor table. I see that Ludovic Blaine has been on the call. Thanks for coming, Ludovic. Airlift has a seat at the California donor table. These kind of partnerships are essential because California is way more Republican than anybody lets on. On just a few $1 million a year, the California donor table is the biggest counterweight to the power of the oil companies, the police unions, the real estate and construction groups that call the shots in our state. So we're very excited that Airlift has a seat at this table. If you want a recent example of what I'm talking about, guess how many new laws came out of the last legislative session to make police more accountable? 0. So you heard a lot about why your continued support is so important now. If you want to learn how to stay engaged and support our work in California and elsewhere, Lizzie is going to share with you how you can help. Turning it over to you, Lizzie.
Thanks, Danny, and thank you, Jonathan. So clearly, everyone, after hearing what Jonathan had to say and what Danny just said, we need your help, for sure. Grassroots groups need watering year-round, and it's what they're doing right now that's going to make the difference in the midterms. We can't wait. So here's some ways you can help. First off, you spread the word to your friends. You do this by talking to everybody you know, or efficiently, you can host an event. We make it easy for you. We really do. We just need your friends. So if you want to do that, put it in the chat, give us your name, and we'll contact you. And I promise we'll make it fun. It's fun and rewarding. Or you could make a donation. And the donation slide is coming right up. You simply can just go to airlift.fund and push the blue button. I know it's there. There it is. Or you can make a check to Airlift and mail it to Corte Madera. It's all really simple. Going to our website takes you right to it. Now, I'm just going to share with you what I do. I am a recurring donor, and it feels good to me because even when I'm doing nothing, I'm doing something. I'm always refilling the watering can that is watering these grassroots, and that's what it takes. So think about these 3 things. ways you can help. We really need you right now. This is the hardest time to ask for money from people. It's not Trump, but it soon will be just as dire. So what you do now is going to make all the difference. After all, we never want to see that gavel in the hands of Kevin McCarthy. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'll see you next month, and stick around for a little bit more of Danny and questions. Take care.
And Jonathan, I hope.
I hope, Jonathan.
Yes.
Excellent.
So Jonathan, talk a little bit more about the actual plan. I mean, one of the things that I learned is that Georgia actually has a better automatic voter registration system than California does. How is that possible?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not sure how it was possible before, but we're changing it now. So I think just to kind of share the equivalence at this point, from what we had heard from our research folks, the equivalent of our automatic voter registration system is actually what they passed in the state legislature in Oklahoma. So if we're actually thinking about political conditions of a state legislature and how progressive of an automatic voter registration system it is, that's kind of like where the level is at right now. And when we say automatic voter registration, there's a lot of things that folks say across the country. But I think for us, what we're advancing at this point is to be able to move California from what we call an opt-in system, which basically would, if folks have been to the DMV in the last 3 years, folks see that there's a question that prompts. We're actually moving into an opt-out system that we believe, one, will enfranchise a lot more people. So in California, the Secretary of State has shared that their opt-out rate is about 50%. They don't share demographics or crosstabs of that, but if we're to actually assume how that works in other states like Colorado and Oregon that have an opt-out system, Oregon has an opt-out rate of 6% and Colorado has 1%. In relation to that, even if we were to remove folks who are ineligible to register to vote through the current system right now, that's roughly about 4.5 million voters that would have been enfranchised over the course of the last 3 years that weren't. So I think for us, we're looking to be able to build that because we recognize that, if we're having an opt-in system, especially in the experience in the field, the people who are very likely opting out are folks who were recently incarcerated and released on parole and don't really know their rights. Folks who are non-English speaking and worried about answering the question wrong, folks who are going through the DMV and just waited 3 hours and want to leave right away. So I think for us, we just recognize this is a simple systemic barrier that we need to be able to fix. And that's what we're going to do. And that's what we're doing right now.
Chris.
Danny, a couple of questions in the chat about Mark Levin and prognosis concerning moving forward and just a perspective Jonathan might have on that congressman.
Could you share? Could you repeat that question? Just one. Sorry about that.
There's a couple of them. Mark Levin is in his second term, California 49, but Republicans would like to take his seat. What is your prognosis?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think folks in South County and San Diego County are probably more equipped and better to answer than I am. But I think from our prognosis at this point is that as there's more mobilization in places like South Orange County from Republican turnout, I think it's going to continue to be a concern. I think Mike Levin is probably the strongest seat out of the 4 seats in Orange County. But that said, I think at this point for us, I think we are definitely concerned that there has continued to be trends of high Republican turnout in wealthier neighborhoods. The field is very active in the opposition. So that's going to be a concern that we have in the long run for us. So just to be able to share with you that I think our prognosis is, yes, it's still going to be a competitive seat. Are we as concerned about the 49th as we are with the 48th and the 39th? Not quite. And I think for us, it's still a seat worth investing in at scale.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a question here from Tomas. which is fighting to make it possible for undocumented people to serve on city councils. And do you have a concern about that? Is that perhaps pushing too far?
That's a great question. I think for us in Orange County, we recognize that I think the part of the disillusionment with the Democratic Party is the fact that they haven't seen like enough of a track record that really represent community interests and issues. And I was writing this response is that I think it was, that campaign is actually by far the most grassroots campaign out of any of the campaigns that I mentioned. It's like actually residents who are undocumented fighting for that power within that city. So I think for us, if anything, it's actually inspired the most amount of inspired the most amount of folks to be able to actually continue to elect more progressive folks. So actually, by pushing the bar on the agenda, I think folks have really kind of starting to see why progressive legislators are even more important than less. So that's really been our experience thus far.
Mm-hmm. Some specific questions. Who's your go-to person down in South OC?
That's a great question. I think for us at this point, we had largely, the only community organization that we've been working with, CHIRLA, is that, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, has actually opened an office in San Juan Capistrano. So for us, like we don't have an official partnership through the table, but we do work on joint campaigns where we see fit. And they're relatively new to the region too. So that is an organization that we do look to. And then I think there are certainly individuals that we really talk to. I think folks who have worked in healthcare and health access, particularly promotoras who are doing in-language outreach for the region, particularly on health access, are folks that we look to as what's going on in the neighborhood, and particularly as Latinx communities continue to grow in that region, in that part of the region.
Yeah, more specific, even electoral questions, which is how to attract more API voters, especially in the 48th and 39th. What's your sense about an approach that would make sense to do that?
Sure. So, I think part of the question and what we learned in 2018 that we saw much less of in 2020 was that there was a lot more intentional efforts for candidates to actually get to know folks who are non-English speaking within each of these regions, particularly in East Asian and Southeast Asian communities. And in these two districts, respectively, Korean, Chinese, and Vietnamese voters within these districts. I think there was a lot more awareness of what Harley Reuter's position would be, particularly in addressing the Vietnamese community in 2018, as well as in the Korean districts within the 39th district back in 2018 as well. I think the hard part is that the infrastructure for opposing candidates is much stronger to be able to get their word out and actually to be able to convene conservative API voters than what we have on the candidate side. So what I would share, for example, is that Michelle Steele was actually on Vietnamese radio for 6 months prior, leading up to the election. So folks actually knew her. Folks, Young Kim has been a television personality for the Korean community since 1993. So if you really think about like awareness, that's hard to be able to entrench yourself that far. And for folks to say, well, I'm not going to vote the person that's been on my TV for that long. And they are actually like main political correspondents and act as news anchors. So for us, like these are like the type of barriers that we need to be able to overcome. It's going to be more than just being able to buy ad time or being able to do endorsement interviews with Democratic committees. Like we're going to have like a real honest organizing strategy where the candidate can actually get to know voters within said districts. And I think what we learned in 2018 is that we were running ads in Korean against the Korean candidate. Like that was something that we did early and we experimented with. And I think right now that's where that gap is missing at this point, like really being able to actually have true candidate efforts to be able to actually build that. I mean, we as an organization can continue to facilitate that. And I think that's what we're learning from this past cycle to do this year. But yeah, that's where we're at this point.
So two related questions. One is a question about what are your budget gaps, especially as you look out 21, 22. And the second question is what might Airlift do, or what are some specific things and places where we can support?
Yeah, so I think to share, I think our gaps at this point is, on the C3 side for this year is is roughly around $750,000. That's not to our core operating budget, but I think for us to be able to increase capacity, I think one thing we learned was that electing leadership is not enough. Like, we actually have to build people who are going to become chief of staffs, legislative directors, folks who are actually working to be able to advance policy. So for us, like, that's our priority this year, to be able to build a track for folks to actually build governing power. So like, it's not enough for us to know the elected, but like, we actually have to build a team around that person to be able to actually be successful. So I think that's number one. On the C4 side, I think outside of a very generous gift from the California donor table of 70,000, like our field budget right now that we were estimating last year to be 1.6 million for the 3 congressional districts is pretty low at this point. I mean, granted, it's still very early for us to do that, but in order for us to be able to run that at scale over the course of the next 18 months, that's the type of budget that we have to imagine. So I think for us, that would be the closest figure that I can give, though, we're going to amend that based on how the pandemic rolls out and what the campaign looks like this year, next year. That's right. Never too early. Never too early.
I think I've cleared all the questions, Danny. We may want to open up if folks want to unmute and ask a couple more, if Jonathan and you can stick around.
Sure.
I had one. Hey, Jonathan, how close did Gil Cisneros lose his congressional election? How close was the voting on that?
It was under 0.5%. So I believe that was like 5,000 votes. And we're talking about an electorate of 180,000 people. So it's like, it was pretty darn close. Yeah. So I would say like that was, within, yeah. And I would say that's like arguably like close to the margin that he won by in 2018, which, folks were saying that it was going to be like a 75-25 split. So in terms of partisanship, so we're talking like based on projection, it was like wildly off. So, but yeah, I would say that's the margin at this point, and that's a field number. That's a number that door knocking wins. That's a number that phone calls win.
And will Gil run again, do you think, next year for that seat?
It's it's a hard question to answer. From what I've heard from folks who are close, like there's a chance. I think a lot of candidates who had run and lost are still really waiting on the results of redistricting to the next question. But I think folks are really kind of shaping up to see what they do next. But what we do know is that there is one Democratic candidate right now that is running at this point, Jay Chen, who also ran in 2018. And he's making a serious run to be able to do it. Whether we endorse him or not, we still haven't gone through that process yet. But yeah, there's a viable candidate, and I think having a Chinese American Democrat run against a Korean American Republican in that district provides some interesting dynamics for the district.
I've got one. Why did you not endorse Gil Cisneros?
That's a great question. He didn't want to. He felt that our questionnaire felt a little too. How do I share this? I'm trying to share this diplomatically. I think he decided after 4 weeks not to be able to complete our questionnaire. Part of our basic premise is that by answering our questions, that demonstrates how the candidate's willing to govern with us. And I think he just didn't check the first box, unfortunately. So. I mean, first step in governance is talking with the people who they represent in the district. So we were pretty aggressive being able to bring him in, but he decided not to.
Didn't want to play.
Yeah. Richard? Oh, yes. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jonathan. I'm really enjoying your comments. I was curious if what you noticed, if anything, in the recent election about Republican grassroots efforts, and what kind of like grassroots is now better known by everybody. And were you surprised by any of their initiatives or actions? And do you see there's an arms race going on in any way that needs a new response, or does tactics change in the face of what they're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think Off the top of my head, I think like you're right in saying that there's been a grassroots effort, especially with like folks that Trump has really mobilized to be able to actually continue to build more grassroots support. So there was a question earlier about the governor's recall and the impact of that, and I think for us, like there is been a huge grassroots movement for folks to be able to, like volunteers on their weekends, to be able to spend their time collecting signatures for the recall. I think that we've continued to be able to see the highest voter turnout, that folks are going into the field registering voter, like Republican voters. So we're seeing that in Newport Beach, Huntington Beach, Yorba Linda, these very wealthy neighborhoods across Orange County they're focusing on their base turnout, and they're building infrastructure in the field, which, you know, there's always been money that's always been really big in the region for candidates. But I think now we're really actively seeing like we're competing to be able to register voters. We're competing to be able to actually get supporters at the doors. And like folks are seeing like a new level and scale of mail and investment through their I think, and for me, like it's like the multi-decade infrastructure of preparing candidates. Michelle Steele, for example, has been a state legislative member for 20, you know, she started there for 20 years ago to actually get elected now. And we're seeing the fruit of their labor. And to us, like we have to, like the question for us now that we have to answer is like, what is our parallel infrastructure to respond? And that's what our table is trying to do right now, but we still need to figure out like, how are we preparing folks not only to run, but to be able to govern, which goes back to the program that we're trying to build out the C3 side.
Let's call it.
I think we're good. And Jonathan, this is talk about an education.
Yeah, I would love to be able to, if anyone has more questions, happy to answer in the future. And please feel free to ask through Danny. And, you know, Danny and I correspond regularly. So happy to be able to be as helpful as possible as folks make some critical decisions.
Wonderful.